A thin strip of ancient parchment rests beneath a glass case in a quiet manuscript room, its surface darkened at the edges by centuries of handling. The fibers are compressed and uneven. Tiny black marks run across the surface where an ancient hand once pressed ink into the material. Nothing about it looks extraordinary at first. It is small, fragile, almost easy to overlook. But these few surviving marks belong to a much larger question about divine law, ancient records, and the hidden relationship between what humanity was commanded to obey and what heaven was believed to record. For centuries, the Ten Commandments have been presented as 10 direct instructions given to Israel at Sinai. Do not have other gods. Do not make idols. Do not misuse the divine name. Remember the Sabbath. Honor your parents. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. The words are familiar. Their order is familiar. Their place in religious history is familiar. But another ancient text describes a world in which divine law operates on a much larger scale. That text is the Book of Enoch. Enoch does not give us a second copy of the Ten Commandments. It does not contain a missing stone tablet. It does not present a literal 11th commandment. What it does preserve is a remarkable picture of heavenly order, divine records, witnesses, judgment, and human actions being remembered beyond the reach of ordinary human courts. And that changes how the commandments can be understood. The oldest surviving evidence for parts of Enoch was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran. Aramaic fragments demonstrated that Enochic writings were circulating in Jewish communities centuries before the medieval manuscripts that later preserved the complete Ethiopic tradition. This matters because it places Enoch inside the same broad ancient world in which Jewish ideas about covenant, law, angels, judgment, purity, and divine authority were being developed and debated. The text describes heavenly beings who cross boundaries, human beings whose actions are observed, and a divine judgment that does not depend on human witnesses standing in a courtroom. There are records. There are appointed places. There are consequences. The language is different from Exodus, but the underlying idea is strikingly familiar. Human conduct exists under a law that comes from beyond humanity itself. The Ten Commandments establish boundaries for worship, time, speech, family, life, marriage, property, testimony, and desire. Enoch expands the surrounding universe in which those boundaries operate. It presents heaven as a place where actions are known and where wrongdoing can be written into a record that cannot simply be destroyed. That is where the hidden connection begins, not with a missing sentence, but with a larger structure of divine accountability that ancient readers could recognize. The parchment remains silent beneath the glass, but the marks on its surface preserve something the centuries could not completely erase. The memory of a world in which law was never merely human, judgment was never merely temporary, and nothing done in secret was believed to remain secret forever. The connection becomes clearer when the Book of Enoch is placed beside the first commandment rather than treated as an isolated collection of visions. The first commandment establishes exclusive loyalty to God. It is not presented as a suggestion. It is a boundary. One God, one ultimate authority, no substitute. Enoch operates inside a similar understanding of divine order, but it expands the picture beyond the human community. Its visions describe a universe structured around a supreme authority whose judgments reach angels and human beings alike. The important point is not that Enoch repeats the commandment word for word. It does not. The important point is that Enoch assumes the existence of a hierarchy in which created beings cannot simply redefine the rules governing creation. This becomes especially important in the account of the Watchers. These heavenly beings descend to earth and cross boundaries that the text presents as established. Their actions are not treated as private choices with no larger consequence. They are investigated, they are judged, their knowledge and power do not place them above the law. In fact, Their position makes their violation more serious, because they knew the boundaries they were crossing. That idea reaches directly into the moral structure surrounding the Ten Commandments. The commandments do not depend on whether a person agrees with them. Their authority comes from their source. In Enoch, the same principle is expanded into the heavenly realm. Even beings associated with heaven remain accountable to an order greater than themselves. The second commandment provides another point of comparison. It prohibits the creation and worship of idols, establishing a boundary between the invisible God and physical representations made by human hands. Enoch's visions are filled with extraordinary imagery, but the text never reduces divine authority to an object that humans can manufacture, control, or possess. The heavenly world remains beyond ordinary human ownership. This distinction mattered deeply in ancient religious thought. A statue could be carried into a temple, a human ruler could command an army, a written record could be hidden, but the divine order described by Enoch cannot be controlled in the same way. Then comes the question of sacred time. The Sabbath commandment establishes a recurring boundary inside the week. Enoch's astronomical sections approach time from a different direction, describing the ordered movements of the heavenly bodies and the divisions of the year. The text is concerned with appointed cycles, measured periods, and the proper arrangement of heavenly movements. It does not secretly rewrite the Sabbath commandment. Instead, it reveals an ancient worldview in which time itself belongs to an established order. This is one reason Enoch became so important to later readers searching for the structure behind divine law. The commandments regulate human life from below, while Enoch repeatedly looks upward and describes the order above it. One text gives commands. The other provides a cosmic setting in which judgment, time, knowledge, and obedience operate. When these traditions are placed beside each other, the supposed hidden clause begins to look less like a missing sentence and more like a hidden principle. Divine law is not limited to what human beings can see, hear, or enforce. It reaches into the unseen structure of creation. It governs actions before they become public evidence. It defines boundaries even when no human witness is present. And in Enoch, those unseen boundaries are preserved through records that eventually bring hidden actions into judgment. That is the deeper connection the surviving manuscripts allow us to examine. The third part of the connection appears when the commandments move from worship into human behavior, because this is where the language of Enoch becomes especially precise about hidden actions and heavenly judgment. The commandment against murder establishes the value of human life as something that cannot be reduced to personal choice. The commandment against adultery establishes a boundary around marriage. The commandment against theft establishes a boundary around property. The commandment against false testimony establishes a boundary around truth. And the final commandment against coveting moves even deeper because it addresses desire before desire becomes an outward action. That progression matters. A person can hide a theft from a neighbor. A person can conceal a lie from a courtroom. A person can hide an intention from an entire community. But the moral framework presented by Enoch assumes that concealment from human beings does not mean concealment from heaven. Again and again, the text describes records, witnesses, judgment, and the exposure of wrongdoing. In the Book of Watchers, Enoch is shown places associated with punishment and divine judgment. The imagery is ancient and unfamiliar, but the principle is direct. Actions have consequences beyond the moment in which they occur. The heavenly court does not depend on human investigators discovering every detail. The record already exists. This is where the idea of a hidden clause becomes much more interesting. The clause is not hidden inside the stone tablets as an erased sentence. It is hidden inside the logic surrounding the commandments. The law assumes that behavior matters even when no one is watching, and Enoch gives that assumption a complete cosmic setting. A human court needs evidence. A village needs witnesses. A ruler needs reports. A community needs testimony. But the heavenly court described in Enoch requires none of these limitations. The books of heaven preserve what human memory cannot. The witnesses are not limited to human beings. The judgment is not restricted by geography or political power. This becomes particularly important when Enoch describes the Watchers. Their wrongdoing begins with a violation of boundaries, but their position makes the violation more significant. They possess knowledge. They possess authority. They know the limits placed upon them, yet they cross those limits. The result is judgment. The message is remarkably consistent with the larger biblical concept of law. Knowledge does not remove responsibility. Power does not remove responsibility. Secrecy does not remove responsibility. In fact, secrecy becomes irrelevant when the final witness is divine. The commandments, therefore, begin to look less like 10 isolated rules and more like visible expressions of a larger moral order. They establish what human beings are expected to respect. Enoch describes what happens when that order is violated beyond the limits of human observation. This also explains why Enoch repeatedly uses the imagery of books and written records. Ancient people understood the authority of writing. A sealed document could preserve an agreement. A written testimony could outlive its author. A record could be examined long after an event had passed. Enoch takes that familiar idea and places it in the heavenly realm. The final record cannot be destroyed by burning a scroll or hiding a tablet. It cannot be changed by a dishonest witness. It cannot be buried beneath a collapsed building. It belongs to a court beyond human control. That is the real significance of the connection. The commandments define the boundary. Enoch describes the archive that remembers every time that boundary was crossed. And once you see that structure, the ancient texts begin speaking to the same underlying question. What happens to an action after everyone on earth has forgotten it? The fourth part begins with the ancient idea of a heavenly record, because this is where Enoch moves beyond moral instruction and into a complete system of accountability. In several passages, the text describes books, tablets, written testimony, and records associated with human actions and future judgment. These descriptions were not added by modern interpreters. They belong to the language of the ancient work itself. Enoch presents knowledge as something that can be preserved beyond the lifetime of the person who possesses it. A person may die, a ruler may disappear, a city may fall, a generation may forget what happened, but the heavenly record remains. This becomes significant when the commandments concerning speech and testimony are considered. The commandment against bearing false witness assumes that truth matters even when a human decision depends upon it. A false statement can destroy another person's reputation, property, freedom, or life. Ancient legal systems therefore treated testimony as a serious matter. Enoch takes that principle into the heavenly court. There is no room for a false report before the ultimate judge, because the complete record is already known. The same framework appears when Enoch describes the consequences of corruption among the Watchers. Their actions spread beyond themselves. Knowledge is transferred. Boundaries are crossed. Human society becomes affected by actions that began in the heavenly realm. The judgment therefore addresses not only the original violation, but also the consequences that followed. This is important because the Ten Commandments also operate beyond immediate punishment. They establish patterns intended to preserve a community. Murder destroys life. Adultery breaks trust. Theft destabilizes ownership. False testimony damages justice. Coveting turns desire against another person's possessions and relationships. Each commandment protects an area of human order. Enoch's visions provide the larger picture in which disorder is eventually exposed. There is another connection that deserves attention: the role of knowledge. Enoch describes forbidden knowledge being given to humanity through the Watchers. Certain arts, practices, and forms of knowledge are presented as corrupting because they are introduced without proper boundaries. The problem is not simply knowledge itself. The problem is knowledge separated from obedience. That distinction is central to the Enochic worldview. A being can know something and still use that knowledge wrongly. A person can possess information and still violate divine order. The commandments provide boundaries for conduct, while Enoch repeatedly warns about knowledge that crosses boundaries. This creates a larger principle. Not everything that can be known is necessarily permitted, and not everything that can be done is morally acceptable. The ancient text therefore treats obedience as more than following visible rules. It is recognition of an order that existed before the individual acted. That is why the heavenly books matter. They represent continuity between action and judgment. Nothing is lost simply because time passes. Nothing becomes acceptable simply because an entire generation forgets it. This is also why later readers found Enoch difficult to dismiss completely. The text preserved a moral universe in which heaven was not distant from human conduct. Heaven observed, heaven recorded, heaven judged. The commandments established boundaries within human life, while Enoch described the cosmic mechanism by which those boundaries remained meaningful even when earthly institutions failed. That does not prove that Enoch contains a hidden missing commandment. It establishes something more precise. The text preserves an ancient interpretation of divine law in which obedience is connected to heavenly knowledge and final judgment. The deeper clause is therefore not a secret sentence buried beneath the familiar commandments. It is the assumption beneath them. The law matters even when no human authority is present to enforce it, because the ultimate record is not kept by human hands. The fifth part brings the evidence back to the manuscripts, because this is where the difference between speculation and what the ancient sources actually preserve becomes important. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was known in Europe mainly through Ethiopic manuscripts, while portions were also preserved in Greek. That limited picture changed dramatically with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the fragments recovered from the caves near Qumran were Aramaic copies of several Enochic writings. These fragments demonstrated that the work was already circulating in the Second Temple period. The significance was immediate. Enoch was not a medieval composition created centuries after the biblical world had disappeared. Its language and ideas belonged to a much earlier Jewish environment. Scholars could now compare ancient Aramaic fragments with later Greek and Ethiopic witnesses and identify places where the textual tradition had changed, expanded, or preserved different readings. But none of those fragments contains a literal hidden commandment concealed inside Exodus. That distinction matters. The evidence supports an ancient Enochic worldview, not a modern claim that someone physically removed a sentence from the tablets of Sinai. Yet the comparison still reveals something important. Enoch's descriptions of heavenly judgment, written records, appointed boundaries, and accountability help explain the kind of religious environment in which divine law was understood as extending beyond visible human society. The Ten Commandments were not simply civil regulations, they were covenant obligations. Their authority came from God. Enoch's visions operate within the same broad assumption that heaven possesses knowledge of human conduct and that judgment eventually exposes what people attempt to conceal. The transmission history itself is also revealing. The Ethiopic tradition preserved the complete work through centuries, when many other communities did not treat it as part of their official biblical canon. Later Western scholars encountered these manuscripts and began translating them. James Bruce brought Ethiopic manuscripts to Europe in the 18th century. Richard Lawrence published an English translation in the 19th century. Later scholarship compared those manuscripts with Greek and Aramaic evidence. Then the Qumran discoveries provided a much older textual witness. Each stage removed another layer of uncertainty about the antiquity of Enoch. What survived was not a single untouched document. It was a chain of witnesses. Each witness had its own language, date, scribal history, and limitations. That is exactly why the manuscript evidence is valuable. It allows researchers to separate what the ancient text actually says from what later readers may want it to say, and when the evidence is examined carefully, the hidden connection becomes more disciplined. Enoch does not secretly rewrite the Ten Commandments. It does something more subtle. It preserves a world in which divine law is imagined as part of a heavenly system of records, witnesses, boundaries, and judgment. The commandments provide the visible rules. Enoch supplies another ancient lens through which the meaning of accountability can be seen. A person can escape a human witness. A criminal can destroy evidence. A ruler can suppress a record. A community can forget an event. But the Enochic vision insists that none of these things can erase the ultimate record. That is why the manuscript fragments matter. They show that this concept is ancient. It was not invented by modern conspiracy theories or recent internet interpretations. The physical fragments survived because generations of scribes copied them, preserved them, translated them, and carried them forward. Their survival does not prove every interpretation placed upon them, but it does prove that an ancient tradition existed in which heaven was imagined as a place of ordered records and final judgment. And when that tradition is placed beside the Ten Commandments, the connection becomes difficult to ignore. The law establishes the boundary. Enoch describes the record that remembers every boundary crossed. The final part brings us back to the parchment beneath the glass, because after all the dates, fragments, translations, and ancient witnesses are examined, the central question is no longer whether a missing sentence can be found. The evidence does not give us a secret 11th commandment hidden behind the familiar 10. It gives us something more careful, and, in many ways, more significant. Enoch preserves an ancient understanding of divine law, in which human actions are observed, recorded, and eventually brought before judgment. That framework helps explain why the commandments could function as more than ordinary rules. They established visible boundaries for a people, but those boundaries were understood to come from an authority beyond human government. The first commandments concern loyalty, worship, sacred time, and the relationship between humanity and God. The later commandments move directly into human conduct: life, marriage, property, testimony, desire. Nothing is treated as completely private when it violates the established order. Enoch takes that principle and places it inside a larger heavenly courtroom. The watchers are judged. Human corruption is exposed. Records remain. The text repeatedly returns to the idea that actions do not disappear simply because people stop remembering them. That is the deeper clause hidden beneath the discussion. Not a sentence removed from stone, but an ancient principle that gives the commandments their lasting force. If divine law comes from heaven, if human beings are accountable to that law even when no earthly witness is present, if ancient Enochic manuscripts describe heavenly records and judgment, and if those manuscripts are demonstrably older than the medieval copies through which Enoch later became widely known, then the connection is not imaginary. It belongs to the history of ancient religious thought. The Dead Sea Scrolls make this even clearer. Their fragments demonstrate that Enochic writings were read and copied during the Second Temple period. They place the text inside an intellectual environment where questions about angels, judgment, covenant, purity, scripture, and divine authority were being debated with extraordinary intensity. Enoch was one voice within that world. Exodus was another. Their purposes were not identical. Their structures were not identical, but both assume that human life exists beneath a divine order. That is the point modern readers often miss when the Ten Commandments are reduced to 10 isolated sentences printed on a page. The commandments are part of a larger covenant framework. Enoch shows another ancient framework in which heavenly knowledge and moral judgment surround human life. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the manuscripts are ancient, if the ideas of heavenly records are present in the text, if divine law is repeatedly treated as binding beyond human enforcement, and if the commandments themselves regulate both outward behavior and inward desire, then the hidden element is not a missing phrase. It is the structure beneath the law. Human beings are accountable even when no human authority is watching. The final image remains unchanged. The parchment is still beneath the glass. The edges are still dark. The fibers are still compressed. The ancient ink still holds its shape. It is still there, still preserving the marks of a vanished hand, still carrying words that crossed languages, kingdoms, arguments, and centuries. And those words still point toward the same ancient conviction: what humanity forgets, heaven remembers.